Okay, having drawn that timeline, let me kind of go back and we'll work through that timeline again a little bit, but we'll start at the middle here. With Jesus, and divided again, you know, 1,000, 1,500, 500, 50, 125. We'll stop at that. Okay. The apostles, Jesus, as we said, lived in this 100-year period. The reason I say 100-year period because we have, you know, some of the disciples were probably born before Jesus. John lived into the 90s AD, so that's Jesus and the apostles. Now, we do know a fair amount about the history of those who followed the apostles. We can name a lot of what are called the early church fathers from the time period right after, like we know that certain people were students of the Apostle John himself, and we have some writings from these people. If we, let me put another mark here at about 325 AD here. The group of early Christians who were leaders in the church and wrote during this time were called the Ante-Nicene Fathers. Ante with an E, not with an I. So Ante-Nicene, referring to the Council of Nicaea and what we call the Nicene Creed in 325. So the ones ante, that is before, like in antebellum, you know, the Nicene, those are the Ante-Nicene Fathers, and there are quite a few of them, and we have a lot of writings, so we can trace the history of the church and the way that Christians taught about certain things and where the controversies were and things like that. We've got a pretty good idea about this. We've got a guy named Eusebius who wrote a history of the church around in here that you can get a translation of his works today. In fact, Dr. Paul Meyer, who has spoken many times here at Trinity, did a translation of Eusebius that you can that I've purchased and several people around the church have purchased. Very interesting reading about the things that happened in the church in those early days. If we think in terms of the globe, I'm not going to try and draw a globe because I'm terrible at drawing. This is the kind of drawing that I do. You know, just not very good at drawing. But if we think in terms of the globe and the Holy Land, where Jesus lived and died and rose again, we have the Christian faith spreading down into Africa, up into Europe, out into Asia, quite extensively through those years. Now, as it headed toward Asia, it bumped up against Hinduism and Buddhism, and then back in the Holy Land, all of a sudden, Islam arose in the 600s and pushed, you know, very forcefully by sword and death, you know, kind of shoved Christianity away for a while. But we know how Christianity spread. What happened in this time period is that you have a pretty unified Christian church throughout the Mediterranean region. And there were a number of bishops basically, what you had were, in any given town, you would have a supervising pastor. Especially in the early days when the churches met in houses. They didn't have big cathedrals and things like that. The church buildings that we know of date from here and afterward, because up until this time, Christianity was illegal in the Roman Empire. And consequently, you don't build a church to invite the Roman soldiers to come and haul your people off. You kind of meet in secret places. But we've got Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom Church in what's now Istanbul, was once Constantinople, one of the earliest Christian cathedrals. But Christians, so there would be churches, at first house churches, and later on some buildings. There would be pastors, but each town would have a supervising pastor called a bishop. And then there were certain places in the Mediterranean world that were the centers of business and commerce and wealth and culture. And in those centers, like Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, there would be a kind of an overarching bishop who would have even more influence yet on the church. During this time period, the bishop in Rome was considered to be first among equals. Okay, if you can kind of grasp that concept, first among equals. It was kind of the concept of the round table, King Arthur and the round table, because with the round table, there's no head to the table, okay? And, the idea being we're all equals around the table, but there was still King Arthur, okay? So the Bishop of Rome was this first among equals. But the Bishop of Rome, over the centuries, began to make more and more claims for himself. And finally, by 1054, comes what was called the Great Schism. When the churches of the Eastern Empire had had enough of these claims. And basically, the Eastern bishops and the Bishop of Rome excommunicated each other. And so today, the churches that are called Catholic versus those that call themselves Orthodox. That's the great schism between the two, East and West, Western Church, Eastern Church. The teachings are not significantly different, but the culture is tremendously different. And if you've ever gone into any Eastern Orthodox church, it's, it takes some getting used to. Things are laid out a bit differently. They place a high value on what they call icons, very elaborate pictures that, and for the younger generation of people that are used to the word icon on a computer, think about this. What's the idea of the icon? If you've got your Word icon on your desktop, the idea of it is that inside here is the whole program. And you click, and it opens out into the whole program, right? They chose the word icon for that reason. The idea of an icon in an Eastern church is that the icon draws you, the viewer, into the biblical or historical truth that's being depicted in that icon, that it kind of pulls you through the picture frame, so to speak, into the reality of the thing itself. And that's why they chose the word icon to describe what happens on your desktop of your computer. Anyway, so the cultural differences are bigger than the theological differences. There are a couple that we will mention as we get along, so Western Church, Eastern Church, the great schism that still exists to this day. So in Europe then, through this time period, you've got the church calling itself the Catholic, that means the one whole universal church, as opposed to the Eastern churches calling themselves Orthodox, which means proper worship, correct worship. The Catholic churches in Europe during this time period, well, actually throughout all of, say, this time period, the church just acquired more and more wealth and power over the centuries. So there was great political power and great wealth. It was all wrapped up in the whole culture of Europe. And unfortunately, with power came corruption. You got a time period in here when there were not one, not two, but three different popes, each of whom was battling it out to try and kill the other two. There is this long history of, many illegitimate children of these popes, and just obvious that the power of the office really corrupted at the highest level and really at lower levels too, amongst the bishops and archbishops and the cardinals and those, you look back at the history of Europe during that half a millennium, and there's a lot of corruption. And what happened was that you have a loss of what's important. When the leadership is about power and wealth, but we're talking about the church, then the central truth of the church is going to get lost in the shuffle. That doesn't mean that there stopped being Christians. Doesn't mean that there were no faithful priests and even faithful bishops and archbishops and maybe an occasional faithful pope. I don't know, but for the most part, they lost track of what they were doing. It's like the old parable of the life-saving station on the coast, where in a dangerous part of the coastline, where the citizens got together because ever so often there'd be a shipwreck off the coast, and they were tired of finding dead bodies washed up on the shore, and so they got together and they formed a life-saving society, and they built boats, and they practiced and drilled, and whenever a ship would shipwreck, they would go out through the surf in their boats and rescue people and bring them back. And then they realized they needed a building to bring them in and build a fire and get them warm and fed and things like that. And then they would have meetings in the building, and they would make their plans and raise their funds and house their boats and things like that. And then pretty soon they got to enjoying those meetings so much, and just really getting along well with each other, and they'd have potluck meals and things like that. And pretty soon they stopped having anybody watching for shipwrecks. And that great parable, unfortunately, of what happens to Christian congregations. That's the kind of thing that was going on. The central truth about Jesus kind of disappeared, and it became more about wealth and power and keeping people in line and things like that. So the situation was ripe in the years before Martin Luther for reform in the church. And a number of people arose during that time to very publicly say, hey folks, we are losing sight of the truth that we're supposed to be gathered around. So unfortunately, the folks who were rising up and saying it isn't about wealth and power were considered to be threats by those who had the wealth and power. And the normal course of things seemed to take those people to death by burning at the stake. You have the guys who made the early translations of the Bible into English. That was a threat, because if people could actually read the Bible themselves, you know, they'd find out that it wasn't all about wealth and power, it was about Jesus and his life and death and resurrection. So in England, you've got guys like Tyndale and those characters going to death by burning at the stake. You got John Huss in Bohemia. He was invited to a church council in 1415 in Switzerland, or what is now Switzerland, and he was given a safe conduct and went and explained what he was trying to teach, that he wasn't, teaching against the Pope, he wasn't teaching against the hierarchy of the church, he just wanted people to, know the truth of the gospel and be allowed to have wine in their communion and things like that, and then they revoked his safe conduct and burned him at the stake. I mean, this was just kind of the way that things were happening in Europe through this time period. When Luther comes along, born in 1483 and died in 1546, in case you are a real history buff, he happened to come along at really just the right time, a God-prepared moment, for several reasons. One, the political situation in Germany prevented the church in Rome from being able to exercise absolute power in Germany. There was too much fragmentation, it was too important to keep people aligned with each other. The Turks, the Muslim Turks, were at the gates of Vienna, and Europe really needed to kind of, not kill each other off, because somebody else was trying to do it, and they needed to be working together. And of course, we got this great, about 1450, one of the greatest inventions of all time, the printing press of Gutenberg in Germany. Okay, so that by this time the printing press had become fairly common, and if somebody wrote or spoke something, it could be quickly, put down on paper and printed off and spread all over Europe. So there was this kind of golden time in which the guy, Martin Luther, shows up. Now Luther was a devout person, at least in part because he got scared. He was doing what his dad wanted him to do. He was studying to be a lawyer. And he had a couple of very unfortunate incidents. Like all of the students of his day, he wore a little short sword, and something happened, and he cut himself with his own sword and nearly bled to death. And that really shook him. And then, a short time later, he was walking from one village to the next and got caught in a sudden thunderstorm where lightning just blasted a big oak tree to pieces right beside him. And he really believed he was going to die. Now I can identify with that, because I remember a little journey up in North Carolina with my buddies. I was about 9, I think, and we had ridden our bikes and walked to go fishing a couple of miles from my buddy's house. As soon as we put our lines in the water, all of a sudden, the whole sky broke loose. Lightning is hitting the water. We pulled our lines out. We started heading home. It's raining, pouring, wind is blowing, and the lightning is literally hitting the trees right beside the road. And we were all, it didn't matter that, Ronnie was 11, almost 12, and I was 9, almost 10, we were crying, we knew we were going to die, So I can identify a little bit with Luther. Now, he was an adult, of course, but, of least a college student. That resembles an adult in some ways. And he thought he was going to die. And he cried out, Saint Anne, which is the mother of Mary, Saint Anne, save me, and I will become a monk. Okay. Now the reason that he said this was that he, as a good Roman Catholic, he believed that, you pray to the saints for assistance in times of trouble. And he believed that the way to please God was to lead the most holy life possible. And as a good Roman Catholic, he had been taught that the monks, having given up all earthly possessions and being, celibate, not celebrate, but celibate, and all of that, because they had given up so much for God, that they were the holiest people. And so Luther, in spite of his father's protests, quit the university and went to become a monk. And Luther had a highly, highly, highly developed conscience. He really thought carefully about what was right and wrong, and he knew that you don't just do wrong things, that when you don't do the right things, it's still done wrong. He knew that when you thought about it and kind of savored it in your head, that could be a yielding to temptation, even if you didn't actually do the thing. For example, let's say that there's a person that's really done you wrong, and you don't actually kill them, but you just take this delight in spending a couple of hours each day thinking of the ways you would kill him, that also is sin. Now, the temptation to kill him, in a flash of anger, isn't necessarily sin if you reject that temptation. But, you can give in to the temptation without the physical act itself. So Luther was aware of all of this, a very highly developed conscience. And even in the monastery, where the other monks thought he was the most pious of them all, because he hardly ever did anything that could be thought of as wrong, but Luther knew what was going on inside his head. And that thought life was very troublesome to him. And he would punish himself for those thoughts. He, as a good Roman Catholic, thought that the way to deal with sin was to punish it, and so he would enforce his own punishments. Even if his father confessor wouldn't prescribe certain penance, Luther would, for example, lay on the cold stone floor, face down for several days without eating or drinking, and in front of the cross, and he tried and he tried and he tried and he tried, and he just couldn't get any peace. They sent him to Rome, and he thought, oh, this is wonderful. They had to send some document to Rome, some kind of correspondence, and they sent Brother Martin, and Martin went to Rome. He thought, at last, I'll be in the holy city and all that. And he got there, and his accounts of that, it was so disillusioning. Just the corruption, the vice, the immorality, even the pilgrims who were climbing up on bloody knees up the steps of place. It just really disillusioned him. So he had a very pious, faithful father confessor, Father John Staupitz, in the monastery, and he kept pointing Martin to Jesus. But that didn't help Martin, because he pictured Jesus as the great judge who, whenever he figured that whenever Jesus looked at him, that Jesus could only see all the wrong things that he had done. And there was a very famous theme for paintings in the Middle Ages of Jesus sitting on a rainbow, which sounds really cute and all that, But no, he's seated on the rainbow, and he is judging the souls of men, and you've got these people going down in flames into hell, and that's how Luther pictured Jesus. So to point him to Jesus didn't help any. So they finally decided that the way to deal with Martin was to, well, kind of get rid of him. They sent him to the new university at Wittenberg to study and become a doctor of theology and to teach at the university. He was a brilliant man. I mean, you couldn't miss that, and you certainly can't when you read his writings today. Well, they sent him there, and for the first time, as he's doing his doctoral studies, Luther actually reads the Bible. Now you may think, wait a minute. Why would he not have been reading the Bible before that? Well, the Bible was considered to be kind of out of reach, too holy. That's why they were burning people at the stake in England, translating it into English. It wasn't for the common people. It was thought that what you needed to do was study what someone had written about the Bible, or maybe what someone had written about what someone had written about the Bible, or maybe what someone had written about 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 the Bible. And literally, there were commentaries on so-and-so's commentary on so-and-so's commentary on the Bible, and then Luther actually starts reading the Bible. And as he's reading the Bible, a very different picture of Jesus shows up there. And it could have happened perhaps with some other verse, but with Luther it was in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, that it all clicked, it came together, where St. Paul quotes the prophet Habakkuk and says, "The just shall live by faith." And as he read those words, the Holy Spirit powerfully spoke to Luther through the words of the Bible, and Luther got it. That it was not him and his actions, but it was Jesus and his work that saved this man, Martin Luther. That it was by trusting in what Jesus had done that all of the good gifts of God came into his life. And he said when that happened, it was like the gates of heaven opened up for him, and he was invited in. And Luther got excited. He started talking about this, he started teaching about it in his classes. He was not only brilliant, he was an amazing teacher, very charismatic man, and people flocked to him, students flocked to his courses, they took notes, they published the notes, they got printed on the printing presses, they got translated into other languages, and Luther became very famous, even though he's just a professor of theology at a university. He became one of the first celebrities in the world. I mean, really a celebrity figure. Unlike Britney Spears and others, he became famous for good reasons, not bad. But there was also that hint of naughtiness, I guess, in that he was saying something different than the leadership of the church was saying. And so maybe people were attracted a little bit because of that rebellious streak going there. But Luther was not rebellious. As he read these things and got excited about them, he believed that this was the message of the church, and that this corruption, these layers of other things had kind of encrusted this truth that was underneath, and he believed that the church would welcome his attempts to get back to the heart of things. Well, probably would have if there hadn't been people with wealth and power, but because there were people whose wealth and power was threatened by what Luther was saying, he ran into trouble very quickly. He was summoned to German city of Worms, looks like Worms, and it's always been a great joy to confirmation children that the gathering was called a diet, and so you got the diet of worms, you know. Yeah, lovely thing. So I guess you can celebrate Reformation Day by bringing gummy worms to church or something, a diet of worms. Anyway, he was given a safe conduct, and he came, and they said, Luther, you know, we want you to recant all these things you've written. And he said, you know, I need a little time. And they said, fine, tomorrow, you know. So he prayed, and he prayed, and he prayed, and he prayed, and he thought, and he reasoned, and he prayed some more, and he read what he'd written, and he came, and he said, these are indeed my books. There was a whole pile of things he had written, that these are indeed my books. He said, I certainly you must not be asking me to recant everything that's in them, because so much of what's in them is what Christians have always taught. You know, you couldn't recant the quotes from the Bible in there or something like that. He said, but there are in them also certain other things that, you know, I may be saying that are new. And he said, I have thought, and I've prayed, and I've studied, and I believe that what's written there is the truth of the gospel. And he said, unless you can convince me by scripture and plain reason, he said, I cannot and I will not recant. And then he said his very famous, here I stand, I can do no other, God help me, amen. And so they, of course, decided that he needed to be excommunicated. And, well, he'd already been excommunicated, actually, by the Pope. You know, they don't bother to actually ask you anything. They just go ahead and excommunicate you first and ask questions later. In those days. Luther then, you know, he was traveling under a safe conduct. He headed toward home. And, of course, they decided that, you know, to revoke his safe conduct and then, you know, basically declare him an outlaw, and anybody that killed him would get a reward. So he's traveling back home. He's beset by this group of horsemen who, you know, drag him out of the cart he's riding in, throw him on a horse, and haul him off somewhere. Well, it turns out those were the employees of the prince of his area, who decided that if he was going to keep Luther alive, he'd better kidnap him. And so they took him to the castle Wartburg, where he grew out his hair, you know, his shaved head grew out, grew a beard, and they started calling him George. Knight George, Junker George. And he stayed there for quite some time, and nobody knew where he was except a handful of people, and they figured he'd been killed and all this kind of stuff. Except that then he starts writing and actually translated the entire Bible, Old and New Testament, into German for the first time. A pretty miraculous translation. The length of time that he spent and the amazing translation that he produced, just absolutely stunning. If you ever needed, you know, just one single proof that Luther was totally brilliant and guided by the Holy Spirit, all you have to do is look at his German Bible. Luther begins publishing then from being in hiding, and finally has to come out of hiding because some of the folks that had been following Luther decided to kind of go off on their own tack. And they decided that the church was so corrupt and things were so problematic that they had to just overthrow everything and start from scratch. And they started busting out stained glass windows and knocking over statues and burning churches, all kinds of nonsense. Luther came back to Wittenberg, denounced them, set people straight, and then shortly thereafter came completely out of hiding and was protected basically for the rest of his life in that region of Germany, even though numerous attempts were made to try and stop him. Well, here's what happened now. You got this guy, and he is preaching what's in the Bible. And he's teaching this, and he's writing this, and it's spreading all over Europe, and he's just stirring up people all over the place because, you know, well, it's like it is in China today. You know, people actually hear what God says, and they risk everything because it's true. And it's worth risking your life for. And it's just, you know, we don't recognize that so much in the United States, you know, who's really excited about the Bible. You know, well, everybody's heard of the Bible, you know. But you go to places where folks have not been kind of inoculated against Christianity, and they get really excited about it. So here's Luther, and he's so excited, and people are coming to believe that he's telling the truth, because it's, you know, now they can read it in their own words in the German Bible and so forth. So Luther realized in the 1520s that he was leading a movement. He still saw it as a movement to reform the whole church, even though he'd been excommunicated by the Pope in Rome. And but he realized, you know, people are following me, and that kind of gives me some responsibilities beyond just being a university lecturer. So in the late 1520s, Luther went on a little tour of the area of Saxony in Germany to get some sense of what was happening in the churches where people were supposedly following him. And he was shocked and appalled by what he found. People didn't know anything about Christianity. Now, to them, Luther was a celebrity, and the things that they did hear from him sounded great, but they just really didn't know anything. So Luther came back to Wittenberg, and he wrote what we call the Small Catechism. Now, if you'll pick up your catechism and open to page 11, and put one finger there, and then go back to page 44, and hold those between your fingers like this, that's the Small Catechism. Okay. And if you look just past page 44, it says an explanation of the Small Catechism. Okay? Let me kind of help you through that. What Luther wrote could be put, was actually first published in poster form. And let me get back to page 11 there. You'll notice that what Luther said was, as the head of the family should teach them, that is the 10 Commandments, in a simple way to his household. Luther figured that it was the job of the father of the house to teach his family the Christian faith. And he wrote it out in simple form, the very basics. He called it the 6 chief parts of Christian doctrine. He wrote that out. He gave the, you know, where it comes from in the Bible, and then a brief explanation like the 10 Commandments. He names the commandment, and then what does this mean, and he tells it. So he published that for the families, so people could learn the basic, central, baby steps of being a Christian. Now you may think, well, okay, that's the Small Catechism. Does that mean there's a large catechism? Yes, there is. Luther found that the priests didn't know any more than the people did. The priests couldn't say the Lord's Prayer. They didn't know anything. In fact, if you want to read the results of that, at the very back of the catechism, let's see what page it's on page 246, is the preface that Luther wrote to the Catechism, and that'll be, you know, some interesting historical reading for you sometime to just kind of read through. He's addressing here. He says, the deplorable, miserable conditions which I recently observed when visiting the parishes have constrained and pressed me to put this catechism to brief, plain, and simple form. He says, the common man knows practically nothing of Christian doctrine. Many of the pastors are almost entirely incompetent and unable to teach. Yet all the people are supposed to be Christians, have been baptized and received the Holy Sacrament, even though they do not know the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, or the Ten Commandments, and live like poor animals of the barnyard and pig pen. What these people have mastered, however, is the fine art of tearing all Christian liberty to shreds. Obviously, fairly colorful language. You can see that how Luther would, get people's attention. They get pretty excited about stuff, even when he was cussing them out, So, so Luther wrote the large catechism for the pastors so that they would, hopefully the pastors would know a little bit more than the people that they were leading. And so that's what we look at today when we go through the catechism. Now the catechism for us furnishes the outline for our class. That's what you'll see on that schedule that I gave to you. But I want you to understand that what we're seeking to do is understand God's Word, the Bible. But there's a problem if you want to understand the Bible. Namely, it's 1,000+ pages. If somebody came up to you and said, well, tell me about the Christian faith, you wouldn't say, here, read this, and when you're done, we'll talk. Not going to be a really effective way of telling someone about the Christian faith. What you're going to do is you're going to summarize the basic parts of it, and you're going to say, and you can learn more about all of that in here. Well, what the Catechism does is it summarizes the most basic truths of the Christian faith, but all of those are drawn from the Bible. So it's kind of like the Bible is kind of the country we want to explore, and the Catechism is the map that we use to explore the country. If I want to learn about what God demands of me, I find out in the Catechism that the Ten Commandments are a pretty good, list of the 10 demands that God makes on my life. So I find out from here that in here are the 10 Commandments, and in here, throughout the book, are places that comment on the Ten Commandments and explain them further. What Luther did was he looked all through this, or he had translated it into his own language, so he knew it pretty well. He went all through the Bible, and he found the parts that talk about the different parts of Christian doctrine, and he summarized them and put them into memorable words. So it's kind of like he condensed it down. When you condense something down, you buy a can of Campbell's soup, right? And it says Campbell's condensed soup. What you need to do to it is add water. You got a can of soup and a can of water. When you add water back to the Catechism, you can go through several levels, and that's what the rest of this Catechism is. When you get past page 44, it goes back through the same material, but it actually gives you the Bible references. Let me just quickly show you, for example, on page 56. Shut up. On page 56, you've got what Luther, the small catechism itself, the first commandment, you shall have no other gods. What does this mean? We should fear, love, and trust in God above all things. So between the two lines there, that's what Luther tells us about the first commandment. But then the next section all through here, up through page 61, what Luther's doing is he's saying, or what this explanation does is it says, okay, that's what Luther says. Let's see if that's right. It asks several questions, and in each question it gives you a number of Bible references. So this is to add water back to the concentration here, and you get back to the Bible. So you've got all these different verses that help you understand, yeah, Luther's right. The summary of it is we should fear, love, and trust in God above all things. But then you get to that. So we've got kind of like the Bible really condensed in the front part of the Catechism, what Luther actually wrote. Then you get it somewhat reconstituted in the back of the Catechism, and then you've got the whole thing, which you want to be studying here. But it gives you a process for studying the Bible then, where you can, say, for example, when we go to talk about baptism, if someone said, well, tell me about Christian baptism, again, I wouldn't say, it's in the book, just read it. But what I would do is I'd go to several different locations in the book where baptism is talked about. And if I do that, what I come up with winds up being what Luther's got here in the Catechism for us. Same thing with the Lord's Supper or with the Lord's Prayer, those different things. It's scattered all through the book. The teaching on baptism is scattered from Genesis to Revelation, you know. You got to know where to look for it. Well, that work's been done for us. It's been handed down to us. We don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we try to study some teaching of the Bible. So that's what the Catechism is doing for us. All right. It will serve as our guide. Now, what happened, to finish the story of Lutheranism here, what happened is that this constant opposition was really a surprise to Luther. He really thought that when he opened up the scriptures and let people see the truth about the gospel, that people would say, thank you, Martin, good job, pat him on the back. Instead of saying, you're a heretic, anybody that kills you is doing us all a big favor. You know. Now, he didn't dwell on that too much. He got to the point where he said, well, same to you, buddy, you know, kind of. He just, you know, didn't worry about it too much. But what he found he had done was he had created a movement within Christianity. And that movement has lasted to this day. Lutherans then, well, first of all, Luther didn't want any church named after him. That was done by the enemies of his followers. They said, well, you're Lutherans. Well, Lutherans, being the kind of people they are, took the insult and said, yeah, that's right, we are Lutherans. You know, you think you're insulting it? Same thing happened, actually, in Antioch. The Bible tells us in the book of Acts, the disciples were first called Christians. And it was probably meant as an insult. But the Christians said, absolutely, that's exactly what we are. We're Christians. What I want you to understand about Lutheran is that Lutheran is not a noun, it's an adjective. Okay? Nobody can say properly, I know we say it improperly, but nobody can say properly, I'm a Lutheran. You know, that's, you do that with any adjective and any other adjective, and you realize it sounds stupid. You know, I don't say I'm a tall, you know, I'm a tall person or a tall man. A very tall leprechaun, perhaps, but I am not a tall. Okay. Now that's an adjective. I'm a Lutheran Christian. That's the movement within Christianity that I am a part of. But what I am is a Christian. Okay, if I'm going to drop one of those two words, I want to drop Lutheran. I'm not going to drop the name of Christ. I'll drop the name of Luther. But I'm proud in a good sense to say that I'm a Lutheran Christian. not because I worship Martin Luther or anything like that. Luther certainly did some very wrong things as well as some very right things. Luther got highly offended that the Jewish people, for example, did not become Christians. He figured that the reason that the Jewish people in Germany were not Christians was because the Christian faith had been misrepresented to them all these years. And he figured as soon as they heard the truth that they would become Christians. Well, they didn't. Well, some of them did, but not too many of them did. And Luther just got furious about that, said all kind of ugly things, and of course later on Adolf Hitler comes along and said, well, you know, what Luther said about the Jews, and it was really a bad thing. So we know that Luther made lots of mistakes, but we're proud to be people who follow in his footsteps, first of all saying, the Bible is the Word of God, and that's going to be what determines what we teach and believe. Not something that someone said about the Bible, but the Bible itself. We are proud to be people who say, we'll let the Bible speak for itself. We're not going to add layers to it, we'll let it speak for itself. We're proud to be people who say, we go to heaven because God has given us this faith relationship with Jesus Christ, because God has sent his Son to die on the cross for us and to rise again from the dead for us. We're proud to be following in that movement within Christianity. So to the extent that you're able to do it, I would say never say to someone, I'm a Lutheran. Say, I'm a Lutheran Christian. Because the other is just an adjective. It's not a... See, it was easier in German. Because in German you can tell adjectives a lot. I mean, it's pretty clear cut, a lot of things, like spelling rules, for example. Very clear cut in German. The German Lutherans, that the tradition that we're a part of, what's called the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, called themselves Evangelische Lutherische. Those are the two adjectives. Evangelical Lutheran Christians. Okay. But in German, you would never think of Lutherische as a noun. You wouldn't say, I'm a Lutherische. I mean, you couldn't do that.